Alan would never forget the day he learned that salvation could have blue skin and desperate eyes, or that the thing he feared most would become the only thing standing between him and death. Before that day, he'd believed the frontier had already taken everything from him, but he was wrong because it had one more lesson to teach, one more price to extract, one more chance to show him that survival meant abandoning every certainty he'd ever clung to. That roar again, the howling of wolves. The sun was setting behind the western mountains, drenching the farm in blood-red light that made everything look like it was already dying, like the world itself was bleeding out across the horizon. Alan stood in the middle of his yard, 40 years old and feeling every single one of those years in his bones like lead weights dragging him down toward the grave. His body was covered in dirt and animal filth, the kind that gets into your pores and never quite washes out no matter how hard you scrub. Sweat poured into his eyes, stinging and blurring his vision, mixing with the dust until his face was streaked with muddy trails. His breathing came in ragged gasps that burned his throat and made his chest ache. Around him, chaos erupted in waves of sound and motion. The cattle bellowed and crashed against the fence posts with enough force to shake the wood, their eyes rolling white with pure animal terror, foam dripping from their mouths as they trampled each other in their panic to escape. 3 wolves circled him in the gathering darkness, and these were not the scraggly predators from Earth's forests that Alan had grown up hearing stories about. These were dreadwolves, native killers that evolution had designed for one purpose only, with massive barrel chests that could take a spear thrust and keep coming, and bony plates running along their spines like natural armor that turned aside all but the most perfect strikes. Their fur was matted with old blood and mud, creating a patchwork of dark stains that told the story of every kill they'd made, every creature they'd torn apart with those massive jaws. Alan lunged forward with his heavy axe, trying to keep distance between himself and the nearest beast, knowing that distance was the only advantage a human had against these creatures. He moved without grace, without any hint of heroism, just the mechanical grinding motions of a tired worker who had done this same dance too many times before, and knew it would probably kill him eventually. The axe connected with bone, and the sound was sickening, a wet crunch that made his teeth ache and sent vibrations up through the handle into his already tired arms. The wolf snarled but did not retreat, did not even seem particularly bothered by the blow. Instead, it circled closer, tongue lolling from jaws that could crush a man's skull like an eggshell. Yellow eyes locked on Alan's throat with the kind of focus that came from thousands of years of successful hunting. The other 2 wolves watched from different angles, their yellow eyes calculating, reading his movements, looking for weaknesses in his stance. They had learned over the generations since humans arrived on this planet. They had evolved alongside human settlers, adapted their hunting patterns, learned to coordinate attacks in ways that their ancestors never needed to. One of them made a false charge from the left, forcing Alan to pivot in that direction and expose his right side for just a fraction of a second. He saw the trap half a heartbeat too late, his mind screaming at his body to move faster than muscles would allow. The second wolf launched itself at him in a blur of fur and teeth that seemed to cover the distance between them in no time at all. Those massive jaws clamped down on his left shoulder with crushing force that drove the air from his lungs. Alan screamed, a raw animal sound of pure agony that tore from his throat without any conscious thought behind it. He heard fabric tear, felt the hot wetness of blood spreading across his chest and down his arm, and underneath it all, there was a grinding sensation that might have been bone cracking under the pressure of those jaws. The impact of the wolf's body weight, easily 200 pounds of solid muscle and bone, drove him backward into the mud with brutal force. His axe flew from his hand, spinning through the air and landing somewhere in the filth beyond reach, useless. Alan tried to grab the short sword at his belt with his right hand, his fingers scrabbling for the leather-wrapped handle, but his left arm hung useless at his side, the nerves screaming messages of damage that his brain could barely process through the flood of pain. The wolf loomed over him, its breath hot and rancid on his face, carrying the smell of rotting meat and death, saliva dripping onto his cheek in thick, viscous strands. This was it, Alan's mind told him with cold clarity. This was how he died, alone on his failing farm, torn apart by animals while his cattle stampeded themselves to death against the fences he had spent years building. Everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, would end here in the mud with teeth in his throat and his blood soaking into alien soil. Then something large and heavy flew out of the tall grass beyond the fence and struck the wolf square in the snout with enough force to make the beast's head snap to the side. The wolf yelped and leaped back, shaking its massive head, clearly surprised by this unexpected attack. It was a rock, Alan realized dimly through the haze of pain that was trying to drag him under. A woman emerged from the grass at a dead run, and his pain-addled brain took several long seconds to process what he was seeing. Blue skin that looked almost purple in the dying light. An alien, one of the blue skins that the settlements whispered about in fearful voices, the ones that humans killed on sight or drove into the forest to starve. Deliasa, though Ellen did not know her name yet and would not learn it for days to come. Her blue skin was covered in scratches that looked infected, in dust and grime that spoke of weeks or months living rough, and her clothes were nothing more than rags that barely held together with makeshift stitching. She had no weapons that Alan could see, nothing but her bare hands and rocks from the ground. Those hands trembled as she raised them, her whole body shaking with what might have been fear or exhaustion or both. But she screamed at the wolves in her own guttural language, words that sounded like rocks grinding together, throwing more stones with wild, desperate throws, trying to redirect their attention to herself and away from the human bleeding in the mud. Under an old wooden bench pressed against the fence, barely visible in the growing darkness, small blue fingers clutched the wood so tightly they had gone pale, almost white. Chloe, 4 years old and weighing maybe 30 pounds soaking wet, watched her mother with wide, terrified eyes that reflected the dying sunlight like mirrors, too scared to make a sound, knowing instinctively that any noise might draw the monster's attention to her hiding place. The wolves were confused by this new target, by this strange blue creature that dared to challenge them when every instinct should have told her to run or hide. Their heads swiveled between the wounded human on the ground and this screaming alien woman, trying to calculate which prey was more dangerous, which target was worth the effort. That moment of confusion, those few precious seconds of hesitation, was all Alan needed to change the outcome of this encounter. Fighting through the burning agony in his shoulder that felt like someone had shoved a hot iron into the joint and was twisting it, he grabbed his axe with his good hand, fingers wrapping around the blood-slick handle, and surged upward with a wild roar born of desperation and rage, and the certainty that if he did not kill right now, he would die. He drove the blade up and under the ribs of the nearest wolf, finding the one spot where there was no bony protection, where flesh was vulnerable and organs were exposed. The axe sank deep, so deep that Alan felt it scrape against the wolf's spine from the inside. The beast howled, a sound that would haunt Alan's dreams for months to come, a sound that was somehow both animal and eerily human, and collapsed, twitching into the mud, its legs kicking weakly as life drained out of it in dark pulses. The other two wolves, seeing their packmate fall and go still, seeing the blood spreading in a pool around its body, made the calculation that all predators eventually make when a hunt goes wrong. The prey was too dangerous, too unpredictable, and this alien female represented an unknown variable that could mean more injuries or death. They turned as one and fled into the darkening forest, their howls fading into the distance but promising a return when circumstances were more favorable, when the prey was weaker or less alert. Alan tried to stand, but his legs would not cooperate, would not take his weight. He fell to his knees in the mud, the world spinning around him in nauseating circles, his vision starting to tunnel and go dark at the edges. The silence after the battle was deafening, broken only by the sounds of his own labored breathing, the terrified lowing of the cattle, and the distant rush of blood in his ears that sounded like ocean waves. He could hear his heartbeat, too fast, too hard, pumping blood out of his body with every beat. He looked up with great effort, his neck muscles feeling like they were made of water, and saw the alien woman approaching slowly, cautiously, her hands still raised in what might have been a gesture of peace. Instinct took over then, that deep human instinct that had been drilled into him since childhood. The lessons that said alien equals danger, that said trust would get you killed. That said, the only good blue skin was a dead one. His hand found the blood-slick handle of his axe, and he raised it toward her, with arms that trembled from exhaustion and blood loss, the blade wavering in the air between them. His vision was starting to tunnel, darkness creeping in at the edges like a closing curtain, and he knew he did not have long before unconsciousness took him. Deliasa stopped immediately, reading the threat in his posture, understanding that wounded humans were just as dangerous as wounded animals, maybe more so because humans had cunning that animals lacked. She raised her hands slowly, palms out, fingers spread, showing she carried nothing, showing she meant no harm. Her eyes met his across the space between them, and there was something in those eyes that Alan's fading consciousness could not quite identify. Not fear exactly, though there was fear there too. Recognition maybe, or understanding, the kind of understanding that passed between prey animals that had both barely survived an encounter with a predator and knew how close death had come. Alan's vision went black like someone had thrown a switch. The last thing he felt was the cold mud against his face as he collapsed forward, his body giving up its fight to stay conscious. The last thing he heard was the distant howling of more wolves in the forest, calling to each other in the gathering night, probably attracted by the smell of fresh blood, and his dying thought was that he had survived the attack only to lie here helpless while the next pack tore him apart. Deliasa stood frozen for a long heartbeat, her chest heaving, looking at the unconscious human bleeding into the mud, then turning her head to scan the dark forest, where more howls echoed through the trees, coming closer. She understood with cold clarity that if she left him here, if she took her daughter and fled into the forest as every survival instinct screamed at her to do, the smell of his blood would draw more predators. Within minutes, they would all die eventually, her daughter included, because the forest held nothing but slow starvation or quick death by fangs and claws. She made her decision in the space between heartbeats, driven by something she could not name, something that might have been desperation or humanity or simple pragmatism. She ran to Alan's side, her feet slipping in the blood-soaked mud. He outweighed her by at least double, maybe more, pure dead weight that would not cooperate or help in any way. She grabbed him under the arms, her fingers digging into his armpits, and pulled with every ounce of strength her starving body possessed. Her muscles screamed in protest, tendons feeling like they might snap, but she dragged him inch by agonizing inch through the mud toward the house, leaving a trail of disturbed earth and blood that painted a clear picture of their path. The distance could not have been more than 50 feet, but it felt like miles, an endless journey during which her breathing came in harsh gasps that burned her lungs, during which her vision grayed at the edges from the effort. Chloe ran ahead on her short legs, her small hands struggling to open the heavy door that was built to keep out predators, pulling with all her tiny strength until it swung inward. As soon as they were inside, as soon as she had dragged Alan's body across the threshold, Deliasa turned and shoved the heavy table against the door with the last reserves of her strength. The table scraped across the wooden floor with a sound like a scream, leaving deep gouges in the wood. She collapsed beside it, her entire body shaking from exhaustion and the aftershock of adrenaline, her muscles twitching involuntarily. Outside, the howling grew closer, no longer distant, but right there beyond the walls. Something large scraped against the outer wall of the house, claws or bone plates dragging across wood, testing the structure for weaknesses. A heavy body slammed against the door hard enough to make the table jump several inches, and Deliasa threw herself against it, adding her weight to hold it closed. Chloe crawled to her mother's side on hands and knees, buried her face against her chest, and Deliasa wrapped her arms around her daughter with fierce protective strength, both of them listening to the predators circling outside, waiting, patient as only apex predators can be. Night fell completely, swallowing the farm in darkness, broken only by starlight that did nothing to penetrate the thick walls of the house. Inside, the space was lit only by dying coals in the fireplace, casting everything in shades of deep orange and impenetrable black that made shadows dance and twist across the walls like living things. Alan lay on the floor where Deliasa had dragged him, muttering in fever dreams, his lips moving to form words that made no sense. his skin pale and clammy with the first stages of shock. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cool night air, and his breathing was shallow and rapid, the kind of breathing that said his body was struggling to compensate for blood loss. Deliasa moved with quick, methodical efficiency, her hands steady despite her exhaustion, because steadiness was the only thing that would keep them all alive through the night. She had no human medicines, no familiar tools, nothing but what she had managed to carry in her small pouch during weeks of running and hiding. She dug into the pouch with careful fingers, pulling out dried roots that were twisted and gnarled, dark brown and hard as wood. These were medicines from her world, from the planet she would never see again, plants her mother had taught her to identify and use before the war had scattered her people across the stars. She put the roots in her mouth, packed them against her teeth, and began to chew with grinding motions of her jaw, working them with tongue and teeth until her jaw ached. Her saliva reacted with the plant matter in ways human biology never could. Enzymes breaking down compounds and activating others, creating a thick purple paste that tasted bitter and made her mouth burn like she had swallowed acid. Chloe watched with frightened eyes that were too large in her thin face, handing her mother strips of cloth that had been torn from what was left of their clothing, scraps that had once been part of a shirt or a cloak, but were now just anonymous pieces of fabric. Deliasa worked on Alan's wounds with movements that were rough but effective, driven by necessity rather than gentleness. She peeled back the torn fabric of his shirt, revealing the puncture wounds where the wolf's teeth had sunk deep into muscle and possibly scraped bone. The wounds were ugly, ragged tears rather than clean cuts, the kind that became infected easily and killed through sepsis rather than blood loss. She packed the purple paste directly into the torn flesh, pushing it deep into the wounds with her fingers, working it into every crevice where infection might take hold. Alan groaned through his unconsciousness, his body jerking involuntarily, his back arching as the paste made contact with exposed nerve endings and created a burning sensation that penetrated even his fever dreams. The paste would fight infection, would seal the wounds from the inside out, would give his body a chance to heal itself. It was all she had, the sum total of her medical knowledge translated to work on alien biology that she did not fully understand. She used the remains of her filthy cloak to bind him tightly, wrapping the fabric around and around his shoulder and chest until the bleeding slowed to a seep, and then stopped entirely until the bandages held the wounds closed through pressure and the coagulating properties of the paste. When she was done, when there was nothing more she could do, she sat on the cold floor with her back against the wall, her whole body trembling from the crash that always followed extreme adrenaline, her muscles twitching and jumping under her skin. Chloe crawled to her side, moving slowly like she was afraid sudden movement might shatter the fragile safety they had found. They slept there on the floor of a stranger's house, wrapped around each other for warmth and comfort, while outside the wolves howled at stars that were not the stars of Earth, while the night deepened and cold seeped through the walls, while Alan fought his own battle against shock and blood loss in the darkness of fever dreams. Morning came harsh and bright, sunlight streaming through the windows and turning dust motes into floating particles of gold that danced in the still air. The light hit Alan's closed eyelids and dragged him back to consciousness with the subtlety of a hammer blow. He woke suddenly, violently, his hands shooting out to grab the axe he had left beside him, his body moving on pure instinct before his mind caught up. Pain exploded through his shoulder like lightning, and he gasped, a sound that was more animal than human, his vision whiting out for a moment before it cleared. Then he saw them, Blues in his house sitting against the far wall, watching him with careful eyes. His first reaction was not gratitude or curiosity or even confusion. It was panic and rage, pure unthinking emotions that rose from his hindbrain where fear lived. He did not remember the details of being saved, did not recall the woman throwing stones at wolves or dragging him to safety. He only remembered the attack, only remembered alien faces appearing through the grass, and his conditioning took over. Every settler knew what happened to people who harbored aliens, what the militias did to traitors, how farms were burned and families were killed, pour encourager les autres. Alan pushed himself to his feet with his good arm, using the wall for support, swaying dangerously as the room spun around him. The movement sent fresh waves of pain through his shoulder, but he forced himself steady through sheer force of will, through years of frontier hardship that had taught him to function through pain. He shouted at them, his voice rough and angry, cracked from dehydration. Deliasa tried to speak, tried to explain, her hands moving in gestures that were meant to be calming, pointing at his bandaged shoulder, at the careful wrapping, trying to make him understand what she had done. But Alan was not listening, could not listen through the roar of fear in his head. Fear was louder than reason, louder than gratitude, louder than any logical thought that tried to surface. He grabbed Deliasa by the arm with his good hand, his fingers digging into her blue skin hard enough to leave marks, and shoved her toward the door. She stumbled but did not resist, did not fight back, understanding that fighting would only make things worse. Alan's voice was harsh, made cruel by terror. Get out! Get out now! If people see you here, if anyone knows I let you in, they will burn this farm down with me inside it. They will hang me from that tree in the yard and let the crows have me. Get out! He pushed them both out onto the porch, Chloe clutching her mother's hand, and slammed the door behind them with enough force to rattle the frame. Then he threw the heavy bolt, the sound of metal sliding into metal echoing in the quiet house. He slid down the door until he was sitting on the floor, his back pressed against the wood, breathing hard enough to make his chest ache. He looked at his bandaged arm in the morning light, at the careful wrapping, at the purple stains where some kind of medicine had been applied with obvious skill. He knew what she had done. Somewhere past the fear, past the conditioning, in the logical part of his mind that still functioned, he knew she had saved his life and probably nursed him through the night when she could have easily fled. But the fear of what his neighbors would do if they found out was stronger than gratitude. Out here on the frontier, in the scattered settlements that clung to existence by their fingernails, people who helped aliens often ended up dead. It was that simple, that brutal, that final. 3 weeks crawled by like wounded animals, each day bleeding into the next in a haze of pain and frustration. Alan tried to work the farm with one arm, the other hanging useless at his side despite the bandages, despite the strange medicine that had kept infection at bay. Simple tasks became monumental challenges. Feeding the cattle took twice as long. Repairing the fence was nearly impossible. Several sections that had been damaged in the wolf attack remained broken, gaps through which predators could enter or cattle could escape. He did what he could with rope and wire, one-handed repairs that were temporary at best. Several head of cattle had escaped through those gaps during the attack and were probably dead in the forest by now, torn apart by dreadwolves or one of the other predators that haunted the tree line. The farm was dying by inches, crumbling around him like everything he had built was turning to dust in his hands. The wound should have festered and killed him through blood poisoning or gangrene, would have under normal circumstances, but the alien medicine had worked some kind of miracle that he did not understand. Still, he was weak, tired all the time, unable to do the work that needed doing. He watched his livelihood slip away and felt powerless to stop it. Deliasa and Chloe remained near the farm, though Alan had driven them away weeks ago. They had nowhere else to go, no other options in a world that wanted them dead. They sat on a bench near the tree line where they had first appeared, the same bench where Chloe had hidden during the attack, and they waited. They looked worse than before, significantly worse. Their cheeks were sunken, making their facial bones prominent and sharp. Their eyes were hollow, set deep in their skulls, with dark circles underneath that spoke of sleepless nights and constant hunger. Their blue skin had taken on a grayish tinge that suggested malnutrition, that their bodies were beginning to consume themselves from the inside. They had not left because leaving meant dying in the forest, and staying meant at least the possibility of survival, however slim. The forest meant quick death by predators or slow death by starvation. The settlements meant death by human hands, by militia or vigilantes who killed aliens for sport or ideology or simple fear. This farm, with its angry human, who had driven them away but at least had not killed them, represented the only chance they had. Deliasa stood up slowly one morning, moving like an old woman though she was only 30, her joints creaking, her muscles weak from weeks of inadequate food. Her eyes held no begging, no pleading, no false hope. Just the quiet determination of someone who had nothing left to lose except the one thing that mattered more than her own life. She walked to the fence with deliberate steps, each one carefully placed like she was afraid her legs might give out. Alan was on the porch struggling to repair a harness one-handed, his fingers fumbling with leather straps that kept slipping from his grip, cursing under his breath. She stood there until he noticed her, until he looked up and their eyes met across the yard. Then she spoke in broken but understandable human speech that she had been practicing for weeks. "I work for you on farm. You feed daughter only, not me, just daughter. I work, she eats. That is deal." Alan looked at her from the porch, really looked at her for the first time since he had driven them away. He saw the desperation, yes, but also something else. A core of steel underneath the hunger, a determination that refused to break even when everything else was falling apart. Then he looked past her at little Chloe sitting on the bench. The girl was not even watching him, was not trying to look pitiful or earn sympathy. She was chewing on a dry piece of grass that had no nutritional value, staring at nothing, her mind probably somewhere else trying to escape the constant gnawing emptiness in her belly. Something inside the hard shell Alan had built around himself over years of frontier hardship cracked just a little, a fissure that let in light he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time. He remembered his own daughter, dead 5 years now in a plague that had swept through the settlements, remembered watching her waste away because there had been no medicine, no help, nothing but prayers that went unanswered. He remembered what it felt like to be helpless while a child suffered. Alan scanned the horizon, checking for any sign of other humans approaching, for the dust clouds that would signal riders or wagons. The landscape was empty, nothing but rolling hills and distant mountains. He made a decision that he knew might get him killed, but felt like the only choice he could live with. He nodded toward the old half-collapsed tool, shed at the edge of the yard. "You live there, not in the house. Never in the house where people might see through windows. Food comes after work, not before. No work, no food. If you see people coming, you disappear into the forest and stay hidden until they leave. If they find you here, if anyone asks, I do not know you. Never knew you. Never saw you before. You are trespassers, and I will say so to save my own skin. Understand?" Delisa nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement of her head. Alan walked to a storage box on the porch and threw her a pair of work gloves that were far too large for her hands, the fingers extending past her own by several inches. "Fence needs fixing where the wolves broke through. 3 sections. Get started and we will see if you can actually work or if this is a waste of time." She caught the gloves and walked to the broken fence without another word, without asking for tools or instruction. She assessed the damage with practiced eyes, eyes that had evaluated problems and found solutions long before she came to this planet, then started working with whatever materials she could find. She worked for hours under the brutal sun that beat down without mercy, turning the yard into an oven, her blue skin darkening to almost purple under the relentless heat. Alan watched from the porch, sipping water and telling himself he was supervising rather than resting, expecting her to collapse or complain or demand water and rest. Instead, she worked with methodical efficiency that genuinely shocked him. She did not just repair the fence in the most obvious way. She reinforced it, bracing the posts with additional lumber she found in a pile of scraps, spotting weak points he had missed or ignored because they had not broken yet. She moved with an economy of motion that suggested experience, that this was not the first time she had done physical labor. By sunset, the section she had worked on was sturdier than it had been in years, possibly sturdier than when Alan had first built it. He tested it himself after she had gone to the shed, pushing and pulling on the posts, and found them solid. Alan's contempt slowly transformed into surprise, then into grudging professional respect. She was more useful than any hired hand he had ever employed, and he had employed several over the years before they left for easier work or died in attacks or simply disappeared into the wilderness. The next day, Delisa was working in the field, turning soil for a late planting that might give them vegetables before the first frost came. It was back-breaking work, driving a spade into hard-packed earth over and over, lifting and turning, moving down the rows with mechanical persistence. Chloe sat in the shade of the fence, too weak to help, playing with small stones she had collected, arranging them in patterns only she understood, building little towers that collapsed and had to be rebuilt. Alan walked past carrying a bucket of water for the cattle, his shoulders still aching, but functional now, almost healed. He stopped near where the girl sat, pretending to check the fence, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a strip of dried meat. He did not hand it to the girl, did not say anything, did not make eye contact or acknowledge her existence. Just placed it on top of a fence post and kept walking without looking back, his boots crunching in the gravel. Chloe waited until he was far away, until he had disappeared around the corner of the barn, then scrambled up on unsteady legs and grabbed the food with both hands, shoving it into her mouth before anyone could take it away, chewing desperately like she was afraid it might disappear if she did not eat it immediately. That evening, as the sun set in streaks of orange and purple, Alan found something on his doorstep, a smooth blue stone, no larger than his thumb, intricately swirled with lighter patterns that looked almost like writing or deliberate art. It was beautiful in its own alien way, polished smooth by water or hands, a gift from a child who had nothing else to give, who wanted to say thank you in the only way she could. Two hunters rode up to the farm a week later, appearing as dark shapes on the horizon that grew larger as they approached. Alan saw them coming from a distance and felt his stomach drop. These were rough men with crossbows slung across their backs and suspicion in their eyes that came from seeing too many people die, to alien attacks, from losing friends and family, from learning that trust could get you killed. They were the kind of men who saw aliens as vermin to be exterminated without mercy, and anyone who helped aliens as traitors to humanity who deserved the same fate. Their names were Matthew and Kevin, and Alan knew them by reputation, if not personally, knew they had killed more than their share of blueskins and boasted about it in the settlements. Deliessa had been working near the fence, was exposed in the open with no good cover between her position and the shed where she was supposed to hide. She heard the horses before she saw them, looked up and saw the riders approaching, and ran. But the distance was too great, the horses too fast, and she realized she would not make it to the shed before they saw her. She dove behind a large haystack instead, pressing herself flat against the ground, trying to make herself invisible, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. But the hunters had sharp eyes, honed by years of tracking animals and aliens through difficult terrain. Matthew, the older of the two, noticed an unnatural blue gleam in the hay where shadows should have been uniform. He reined his horse to a stop, his hand moving to the release on his crossbow, thumbing off the safety with a soft click that carried in the quiet air. "What you got hiding there, Alan? Some kind of monster?" His voice was casual, but his eyes were hard, looking for any sign of deception. Alan stepped between them and the haystack, positioning himself so they would have to go through him to get to her. His hand dropped to the handle of his axe, hanging from his belt, the movement casual but unmistakable to anyone who understood the language of violence. "That is my dog. Got a skin disease, some kind of mange, losing fur all over. Had to paint him with medicine that stained his skin blue. He looks strange, but he is not contagious anymore, though he was for weeks. You come near him now, you might still catch something. Seen men scratching themselves raw for months after catching mange from animals?" Kevin, the younger hunter, leaned forward in his saddle, squinting at the haystack. "That is a mighty strange color for a dog, even a sick one. Looks more blue than any mange I ever seen." Alan shrugged, his face showing nothing but mild annoyance at having his word questioned. "Medicine is blue, made from some kind of root. Dog is mostly bald from the disease, hardly any fur left. Makes the skin look stranger than it is. You want to risk catching it, go ahead and take a closer look. But you will be explaining to your wives why you are covered in sores and scratching yourself bloody in a week." He let his hand rest on the axe handle, a subtle reminder that he was armed and willing to defend his property. The hunters exchanged glances, having a silent conversation with their eyes. They wanted to push it. Alan could see that in the set of their jaws, in the way their hands stayed near their weapons. They were not stupid enough to risk disease without good cause, but they also were not quite ready to call Alan a liar to his face while he had that axe, and they were still mounted, at a disadvantage if it came to violence. Matthew spat in the dirt, a gesture of contempt. We will be back to check on that dog of yours, Alan. Make sure it is what you say it is. And if we find out you are lying to us, if we find out you are harboring blueskins on this property, there will be consequences. You understand me? The settlements do not take kindly to traitors. I understand you, Alan said flatly, his voice carrying no emotion. Now get off my property before I decide you are threatening me, and act accordingly. They rode off slowly, taking their time, making it clear they were leaving by choice rather than intimidation. But their threat hung in the air like smoke, acrid and choking. Alan waited until they were completely out of sight, until even the dust from their horses had settled, before letting out the breath he had been holding. His hands were shaking slightly, a delayed reaction to how close that had come to violence. Time was running out. Word was spreading through the settlements that something strange was happening at Alan's farm. Someone would come eventually with enough men that Alan's axe would not matter, that no amount of talk would dissuade them from searching every building, from burning everything to the ground if they had to. The wolves came again a few nights later, their howling carrying across the dark fields as a warning that made the cattle nervous and sent them milling around in their pen. This time the pack had learned from their previous encounter with this farm and its defenders. They did not attack head-on where humans might be waiting with weapons. They were smarter than that, cunning in the way that only survivors can be. Instead, they dug under the fence, their powerful claws scraping through dirt and roots, creating a tunnel just large enough for their bodies to squeeze through. Alan heard the sound from inside the house, a rhythmic scraping that did not belong to the normal sounds of night. He bolted from his bed without bothering to dress fully, grabbing his axe from beside the door, and ran toward the noise in his boots and sleeping clothes. Deliasa heard it too from the shed, where she and Chloe slept on piles of straw that provided some cushioning against the hard floor. She grabbed a pitchfork that she had seen hanging on the wall, the first weapon she could find, and ran toward the sound of digging. They met in the middle of the yard just as 3 wolves squirmed through the gap they had created, emerging from the hole one after another, their fur covered in dirt and their eyes gleaming in the moonlight. The lead wolf, a large male with a scar across its snout, saw the humans and snarled, showing teeth that looked like white daggers. It was their first real fight together, their first time working as a unit rather than as master and servant. Alan swung his axe in a wide arc, putting his whole body into it, forcing the lead wolf back several steps. The wolf tried to circle around him, but Deliasa thrust with the pitchfork, catching the animal in the side with the metal tines just deep enough to draw blood and make it yelp. The wolf twisted with incredible strength, nearly ripping the pitchfork from her hands, its muscles bunching as it prepared to leap at her exposed throat. Alan brought his axe down on its skull with a crunch that made both humans wince, ending its life instantly. The second wolf tried to flank them from the left, looking for an opening in their defense. Alan swung at it but missed, the axe passing through empty air. The wolf dodged back, then lunged forward again, playing a dangerous game of feint and attack. Deliasa stepped in and thrust with the pitchfork, forcing it back, buying Alan time to reset his stance. The third wolf ignored them entirely, understanding that the defenders were occupied with its packmates. It went straight for a young calf that was separated from the main herd, that had wandered too close to the fence, and was now isolated and vulnerable. The calf bleated in terror as the wolf closed in, its teeth bared, ready to go for the throat. Deliasa saw the movement in her peripheral vision, saw the wolf about to kill the helpless animal, and made a split-second decision. She threw herself between the predator and the calf, taking the wolf's lunge directly on the pitchfork's tines, the impact driving her back 3 feet, her boots sliding in the dirt. The force was tremendous, easily enough to knock her down if she had not braced herself, if she had not planted her feet and leaned into the push. She held the pitchfork steady, the tines sunk deep into the wolf's chest, the animal's weight hanging from the weapon, its legs kicking weakly. Alan came in from the side, seeing her vulnerable position, and his axe found the wolf's spine, cutting through bone and nerve with a sound like breaking wood. The beast went limp immediately, dead before it hit the ground. The remaining wolves in the hole, seeing 3 of their pack dead in a matter of seconds, decided the hunt was not worth the cost. They fled back the way they came, squirming through the tunnel and disappearing into the forest, their howls fading into the distance. Dawn came slow and red, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. Alan and Deliasa stood in the yard, breathing hard, their chests heaving from exertion and adrenaline, covered in blood and mud that was impossible to distinguish in the dim light. Alan saw how she had put herself at risk to save the calf, how she had not hesitated even though it meant exposing herself to attack, and he understood something fundamental about her character. She had not saved the animal to impress him or earn favor. She had done it because it was the right thing to do, because letting an innocent creature die when she could prevent it was not acceptable to her. He looked at her for a long moment, really seeing her rather than seeing an alien, seeing the person underneath the blue skin. Then he nodded toward the house, a single decisive movement. "Come on, eat inside today. No reason to make you eat in the shed after that." It was the first time they had been allowed past the threshold since the day Alan had thrown them out. Chloe clung to her mother's hand as they walked through the door, looking around the house with wide eyes, taking in details she had not been able to see that first night in the darkness. The house was simple, functional rather than comfortable, with rough wooden furniture and a few personal items that suggested Alan had once had a family, though he never spoke of them. He set out bread that was a few days old but still edible, some preserved meat that was tough and salty, and water that was cool from the well. They ate in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Not the hostile silence of master and servant, but the comfortable silence of people who had fought together and understood that words were not always necessary. An understanding was forming between them, wordless but real, built on the foundation of shared struggle and mutual respect, earned through action rather than given freely. Alan knew with grim certainty that the hunters would return, and he knew that the wolves were getting more aggressive as winter approached and food grew scarce. The predators were desperate, driven by hunger to take risks they would not normally take, to attack defended positions and test human resolve. He made a decision that might keep them all alive, or might just delay the inevitable. They would prepare for war, would turn the farm into a fortress as much as possible. He brought out a bow from his storage, human-made and sized for human hands, carved from wood that grew on Earth and shipped across the stars at enormous expense. Deliasa tried to hold it, but it was awkward, designed all wrong for her grip and her arm length, the proportions not matching her physiology. The string was too tight for her fingers, the draw weight too heavy for her build. Still, she adapted with remarkable speed, learning to compensate for the differences, to adjust her stance and her pull to make the weapon work despite its poor fit. Alan taught her to aim, to lead a moving target, to account for wind and distance. She taught him things in return, knowledge from her own world that translated surprisingly well to this one. "Wolves smell like rot-down wind," she told him in her improving human speech, the words coming smoother now with practice. "Old blood and decay. Humans smell like metal and sweat, like iron and salt. Learn the difference. Know what comes before you see it." They worked together on defenses over several days, rising before dawn and working until after dark. They dug pit traps in the forest approaches, deep holes covered with branches and dirt that would collapse under weight, with sharpened stakes at the bottom, pointing upward to impale anything that fell in. They set net traps that could tangle an attacker, heavy rope nets weighted with stones that would drop from trees when triggers were tripped. They hammered sharpened stakes into the ground, angled outward from the fence, creating a barrier that was difficult to cross without injury. They reinforced gates and doors, adding bars and braces. This was not a farmer and his hired help anymore, preparing for routine threats. This was a combat unit preparing for war, two people who understood that death was coming and could only be delayed rather than prevented. The day came at noon, when the sun was high and hot enough to make the air shimmer, when shadows were short and offered no concealment. The same hunters returned, but this time they had brought friends, reinforcements who shared their views about aliens and those who harbored them. 5 men total, and they had been drinking for courage, their voices loud and their movements aggressive as they rode into the yard. They knew the truth now, or thought they did, having pieced together rumors and observations into a narrative that painted Alan as a traitor. "You are hiding blueskins here," Matthew shouted across the yard, his face red with anger or alcohol or both. "You are a traitor to your own kind, Alan, helping the enemy, giving them shelter when they should be dead." Alan walked out onto the porch slowly, deliberately, with a spear in his good hand and the axe at his belt. His shoulder still ached when he moved it wrong, but he could fight now if needed, could defend himself and what was his. "She works better than all of you put together," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the yard without shouting. "She does not complain, does not steal, does not get drunk and lazy. She earns her keep. Now get off my land before I make you get off." The leader, Matthew, pulled out a torch that was already lit, the flame dancing in the afternoon breeze, fed by oil-soaked rags that would burn hot and fast. "We know they are in that shed," he screamed, his control slipping. "We are going to burn them out and watch them die, and then we are going to burn your house too for good measure." He hurled the torch in a high arc that carried it over the fence and onto the shed's roof. It landed with a thump, and within seconds the dry wood caught fire, flames spreading rapidly, smoke billowing up black and thick enough to be seen for miles. But Deliasa and Chloe were not in the shed, had not been there since early morning when Alan had warned them that trouble might come today. They were in the root cellar under the house, hidden behind barrels of preserved food and sacks of grain, where searchers would not think to look without tearing up floorboards. Alan had learned to think ahead, to plan for contingencies to keep his most valuable assets protected. The fire was bright and loud and spreading fast, consuming the shed in minutes, and nobody noticed what it attracted from the forest. From the tree line, drawn by the noise and commotion and the scent of humans standing in the open with their attention focused elsewhere, the wolves came in a coordinated rush. Not 3 this time, not a small hunting party testing defenses. The whole pack, 15 strong, led by a massive alpha that the locals called Morlock because of its size and intelligence. The beast was scarred and ancient by wolf standards, bigger than any dread wolf Alan had ever seen in his years on this planet. Its bone plates were thick as a man's fist, its muscles like steel cables under its fur. It had survived countless hunts, countless confrontations with humans and other predators, and it had learned that noise and fire meant distracted prey. The wolves hit the hunters from behind without warning, coming out of the forest in a wave of fur and teeth and primal hunger. Panic erupted instantly and absolutely. Men screamed, high-pitched sounds of terror that did not match their tough image. Crossbows fired wild, the operators too panicked to aim properly, bolts striking friends as often as wolves, friendly fire taking down one hunter immediately. Kevin took a bolt through the shoulder from his own ally and fell from his horse, hitting the ground hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. The hunters had their backs to the forest, had been focused on the farmhouse and the burning shed, and they died for that mistake. Teeth found throats, jaws clamping down and shaking, tearing through flesh and windpipe. Claws raked across faces, opening deep furrows that exposed bone. Blood sprayed across the dry grass in arterial spurts, painting the ground red. The horses reared and bolted, throwing riders who had not secured their saddles properly in their drunken confidence. Alan shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "To me! Get to me now!" Deliasa burst from the house, the cellar door slamming open, dragging Chloe with her. They had been waiting in the darkness below, listening to the sounds of violence above, waiting for Alan's signal. The 3 of them formed a triangle in the middle of the yard as chaos swirled around them, their backs to each other so no angle was undefended. Men ran or died around them. One hunter, Jerry, tried to reach his horse, but a wolf brought him down 5 feet from the saddle, its jaws closing on his calf and dragging him backward. He screamed and tried to crawl away, but 2 more wolves joined the first, and his screams cut off abruptly. Another hunter, Matthew, managed to loose 3 bolts from his crossbow into a charging wolf, each bolt striking true. But 2 more wolves got him from the sides while he was reloading, and he went down under their combined weight. The alpha, Morlock, ignored the fleeing and dying humans entirely. It had seen this kind of chaos before, understood that these panicked creatures would kill themselves or run away without further effort. The real prize was the three standing calmly in the center, the ones who were not panicking, the ones who were ready to fight. It stalked toward them through the smoke and flames, its massive paws making no sound, its pack spreading out in a practiced formation to surround the triangle. They were trapped, caught in a ring of fire from the burning shed on one side and fangs on all other sides. The burning shed collapsed with a tremendous roar, sending embers spiraling into the sky like malevolent fireflies, the heat washing over them in waves. The smaller wolves tested the defenses like soldiers probing enemy lines for weaknesses. Deliasa held a hatchet she had grabbed from inside the house, stood over Chloe like a statue, and swung at anything that came close enough to threaten her daughter. Her movements were quick, almost inhuman, driven by the desperate strength of a mother protecting her child, by adrenaline that turned pain and exhaustion into fuel. She caught one wolf across the snout with the hatchet's edge, opening a gash that sent it yelping backward, pawing at its face. Another came at her from the side, trying to exploit her committed swing, but she pivoted faster than seemed possible, bringing the hatchet down on its shoulder with enough force to bury the blade deep in bone and muscle. The blade stuck, locked in place by bone, and she could not wrench it free. She abandoned the weapon without hesitation, grabbed a broken fence post that lay nearby, and used it as a club, swinging it with both hands. The post connected with another wolf's ribs with a satisfying crack of breaking bone, sending the animal tumbling. Alan faced Morlock in what felt like a duel from ancient Earth. Man against beast, the oldest conflict in human history. The alpha was patient, circling slowly, its yellow eyes calculating, reading Alan's stance and looking for weaknesses. It feinted left and Alan fell for it, committed to the swing, putting his weight behind the axe. Morlock came in from the right impossibly fast for something so large, moving with the speed of youth despite its age and scars. It hit Alan like a battering ram, 300 pounds of muscle and bone moving at full speed. The impact lifted Alan off his feet and drove him to the ground, hard enough to knock the air from his lungs. His axe flew from his grip, spinning through the air and landing somewhere in the smoke, useless and out of reach. The wolf's jaws came down, aiming for Alan's throat where a single bite would end everything. He got his forearms up just in time, crossing them in front of his throat, felt teeth scrape against bone hard enough to leave deep gouges. He was holding the wolf's jaws apart with his bare hands, every muscle in his arms and shoulders screaming in protest, tendons feeling like they might snap. The wolf's breath was hot and rancid, carrying the smell of rotting meat and death and old blood. Saliva dripped onto Alan's face in thick, viscous strands that burned where they touched his skin. His arms were shaking uncontrollably, muscles reaching the limits of endurance. He was losing, could feel his strength failing, could feel the jaws slowly closing, despite his best efforts. Chloe saw her friend, the man who had placed food on the fence post for her when she was starving, the man who had allowed her mother to stay when he could have let them die, the man who had become something like family in this strange new arrangement. She saw him dying under the massive wolf, saw his arms shaking as they failed, saw his face twisted in agony. She broke away from her mother's protective grip, her small legs pumping. Deliasa screamed her daughter's name, reached for her, but could not abandon her position without exposing herself to the wolves that were still testing her defenses. The little girl ran forward with nothing but a small leather pouch clutched in her hands, a pouch that her mother had been preparing over the past weeks. It was filled with crushed red pepper that grew wild near the forest edge, and dried poisonous berries that Deliasa had been grinding down for use in preserving food, creating a mixture that would burn skin and eyes on contact. Chloe did not hesitate, did not slow down, running right up to the massive wolf so close she could have reached out and touched its blood-matted fur. She threw the powder with all her tiny strength, hurling it in an arc that carried it directly into Morlock's eyes and nose and open mouth. The effect was immediate and devastating. Morlock released Alan instantly and jerked back, its head shaking violently from side to side, sneezing with explosive force, trying to clear the burning substance from its sensitive nose and eyes. It was blinded, disoriented, pawing at its face with its front paws, completely vulnerable for the first time in the fight. Alan rolled to his feet, his arms screaming in pain, and grabbed the first weapon he saw, a section of fence post that was burning on one end from the shed fire. He drove it like a spear with all his remaining strength, with every ounce of power he had left, punching it through the wolf's chest and out the other side. The burning end seared flesh as it passed through, cauterizing as it went, the smell of burning fur and meat filling the air. Morlock made a sound, a whining yelp that seemed too small for such a massive creature. A sound that was somehow pitiful despite coming from a killer. It collapsed slowly, its legs folding, its massive body settling into the dust. Yellow eyes dimming as life drained away. The pack froze as if someone had thrown a switch. They had lost their leader, their alpha, the dominant force that had kept them organized and effective. Wolves lived and died by pack hierarchy, by the understanding that the alpha's word was law, that the alpha's death meant the social structure had collapsed. Without Morlock, they had no direction, no coordination, no reason to continue this fight that was costing them packmates. They scattered into the forest like shadows dissolving at dawn, howling as they went, the sound carrying their grief and confusion, fading into the distance until only echoes remained. Rain began to fall almost immediately, as if the universe had been waiting for the violence to end. It started gentle at first, just a few drops that sizzled against the hot ground and the burning remains of the shed. Then it came heavier, sheets of water that fell from dark clouds that had rolled in without anyone noticing during the fight. The rain hissed against the burning buildings, turning flames to steam, creating clouds of white vapor that mixed with the black smoke. The fire died slowly under the downpour, flames sputtering and going out one section at a time until only charred timber remained, still radiating heat but no longer burning. The rain washed over them all, cold and cleansing, washing away blood and soot and the stink of death. The yard was a battlefield that would have looked familiar to soldiers from any era of human history. 2 dead hunters lay in the mud, their weapons scattered around them, their eyes staring at nothing. 3 more had fled into the forest and might survive, or might become food for other predators. 3 dead wolves, including the massive Morlock, were sprawled across the torn earth, their blood mixing with human blood, and rain to create dark rivulets that flowed toward the lower ground. The fence was mostly destroyed, entire sections knocked down or burned. The shed was completely gone, reduced to a skeleton of charred beams and ash. The house had scorch marks running up one side where embers had tried to take hold, but the rain had prevented them from spreading. Everything smelled like smoke and blood and rain, a mixture that would linger for days. Alan sat on what remained of the porch steps, so exhausted he could barely keep his eyes open, his body demanding rest that he could not afford to give it yet. His arms were covered in deep puncture wounds from holding Morlock's jaws, bleeding freely and mixing with the rain, his blood diluting and running pink down his skin. Every muscle in his body ached, that deep bone-level exhaustion that came from pushing beyond normal limits. Deliasa walked toward him through the rain, her movements slow and pained, her blue skin blackened with soot and covered in alien blood from the wolves she had fought, with scratches and bruises that would take weeks to heal. She sat down beside him without asking permission, her body settling with a groan. They sat there together, neither speaking, neither able to speak, just existing in the aftermath, watching the rain wash the blood from the yard in slow streams that carved channels through the mud. Chloe approached slowly, tentatively, her small feet splashing in puddles that had formed in the uneven ground. She looked up at Alan with those wide blue eyes that seemed too large for her small face, eyes that had seen far too much violence for a 4-year-old child. Then she laid her head against his knee, trusting and exhausted, seeking comfort in the only place she could find it. Alan hesitated, his hand hovering in the air above her head for a long moment, trembling slightly from exhaustion and something else. He looked at that hand, rough and calloused from years of manual labor, covered in scars from countless injuries, coated in wolf blood and his own blood mixed together. Slowly, carefully, like he was afraid he might break her with his strength, like she was made of glass. He lowered his hand and rested it on Chloe's small blue head, his palm nearly covering her entire skull. The girl did not pull away, did not flinch. She pressed closer, seeking the warmth and safety that his presence represented. Deliasa let out a long breath that seemed to come from her core, and her shoulders dropped, releasing tension she had been carrying for weeks, maybe months. Maybe since the moment she had fled her dying settlement with her daughter. For the first time since arriving on this hostile planet where everything wanted to kill her, where humans shot aliens on sight and wolves hunted anything that moved, she allowed herself to relax. Not completely, never completely, because complete relaxation meant death on the frontier. But enough to feel something other than constant vigilance and fear, enough to believe that maybe they had found something like safety here. The rain came down harder, becoming a proper storm, washing away the soot and blood and filth, carrying it all into the earth in dark streams that would feed the soil. The clouds were thick and gray, blocking out the sun completely, but there was light behind them somewhere, fighting to break through, promising that eventually the storm would pass and the sun would return. The three of them sat together in the ruins of the farm, too tired to move, too hurt to care about getting wet, too relieved to be alive to think about what came next. They had survived. Against wolves and humans and their own fears, they had survived. That was enough for now, enough to build on, enough to give them hope that maybe they could continue to survive if they stayed together. Over the next several weeks, they rebuilt what had been destroyed. It was slow work, made slower by Alan's injuries, which took longer to heal at his age than they would have in his youth. His arms healed but left deep scars, parallel lines where Morlock's teeth had gouged the flesh, permanent reminders of how close death had come. Deliasa showed him how to make a salve from forest plants she had found growing near the tree line, plants that looked similar to ones from her homeworld, grinding them into paste that reduced the pain and seemed to speed healing. They fixed the fence together, working side by side, rebuilding it stronger than before. Learning from how the wolves had gotten through, they reinforced the posts with additional bracing, buried them deeper, used more wire. They buried the dead hunters far from the farm in unmarked graves that would never be visited, and burned the wolves in a pyre that could be seen for miles. They did not talk about what had happened, did not discuss the future, or make plans beyond the next day's work. They just worked, fell into a routine that was comfortable in its predictability. More neighbors came eventually over the following months, drawn by stories of the fight that had spread through the settlements like wildfire, growing in the telling until it became almost mythical. They found Alan working his farm with a blue-skinned woman and child beside him, working together like they had been doing it for years, like it was the most natural thing in the world. There were questions, of course, as spoken and unspoken. Suspicion hung in the air thick enough to taste. Some people left in disgust, spitting on the ground and muttering about traitors and abominations. Others watched from a distance, their faces unreadable, judging in silence. A very few, a precious few, understood. They had lost people too, had made their own compromises with ideals in order to survive, had learned that the frontier was harsh enough without adding unnecessary enemies. Alan had adapted to survive, had changed his thinking when circumstances demanded it. That made him dangerous in a different way, dangerous to the neat categories people like to maintain, dangerous to the prejudices that kept communities divided. One morning when frost had started to appear on the grass, signaling the approach of winter, Alan was working on reinforcing the barn when he heard voices from the road. A family was passing through, refugees from a settlement that had been overrun by a different kind of predator, one of the massive herd animals that occasionally went into must and destroyed everything in their path. They were desperate, hungry, their clothes torn and dirty, looking for any place that might take them in for just a few days, just long enough to rest and gather strength to continue their journey. The father, a man named Harriet with a wife and 3 children, saw Deliasa working in the field, her blue skin unmistakable even at a distance, and his face twisted with disgust that was deeply ingrained. He started to say something, to voice the prejudice that had been bred into him since childhood, his mouth opening to form words of condemnation. Alan stepped between them before the words could fully emerge, his body language making clear that he would not tolerate disrespect on his property. He did not raise his voice, did not need to. His reputation had grown enough that the set of his jaw carried weight. She saved my life, twice, fought wolves beside me when she could have run. You have a problem with that? You can keep walking and find hospitality elsewhere. The father looked at Alan's scars, visible where his shirt collar fell away, at the rebuilt farm that showed signs of recent battle, at the little blue girl who was carrying a bucket of water with fierce concentration, her small arms straining but refusing to give up or ask for help. He looked at his own hungry children, saw their hollow eyes and thin faces. He swallowed his words, his prejudice warring with his need, and pride losing to practicality. We will keep walking then, but thank you for not turning us away with violence. We have seen enough of that. As they left, Deliasa came to stand beside Alan, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. You did not have to do that, she said quietly. Her human speech was getting better every day, smoother, more natural, losing the harsh edges that marked it as foreign. Yes, I did, Alan replied without hesitation. He did not explain further, did not elaborate on his reasoning. He did not need to. Some things were understood without words, like the fact that they were family now in some way that transcended blood or species, bound together by shared survival and mutual respect. Winter came hard and fast that year, earlier than usual according to the old-timers who track such things. The first snow fell in mid-autumn, covering the farm in white that quickly turned to gray slush in the yard, where feet and hooves trampled it into mud. They prepared as best they could, working long days to get ready before the worst of the cold arrived. They stored food, preserved meat and vegetables, stockpiled hay for the cattle. They reinforced buildings, plugging gaps where wind might penetrate, adding extra layers to roofs. They cut firewood, endless cords of it, until their arms ached and their hands were covered in blisters. The wolves stayed away, having learned their lesson about this particular farm. Word had spread in the pack that this place meant death, that the humans here fought back with deadly efficiency, that the alpha himself had fallen there. Other predators tested them occasionally, driven by hunger to take risks, but nothing like that final battle that had left so many dead. They developed routines that gave structure to their days, that made the work manageable through predictability. Alan would wake before dawn while darkness still pressed against the windows, check the animals to make sure nothing had gotten into the barn overnight, start whatever repairs were most urgent. Deliasa would gather eggs from the chickens that pecked at her hands, milk the few cattle that remained from the original herd, prepare food for the day. Chloe would help where she could, carrying small loads that she could manage, watching everything with those bright, curious eyes, absorbing information like a sponge. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire that crackled in the hearth, sharing warmth and silence that was comfortable rather than awkward. Alan started teaching Chloe human speech more formally, pointing at objects and saying the words slowly and clearly, making her repeat them until the pronunciation was correct. She was a quick learner, picking up words and grammar with the speed that only children possess, that gift for language that fades with age. One night, when a bad storm rolled in from the mountains with the fury that winter storms sometimes carried, wind howled around the house like a living thing, driving snow through every crack and gap they had not managed to seal. The fire struggled to stay lit, the draft pulling at the flames, and cold air seeped through the walls in waves. Chloe was frightened by the noise, by the way the house creaked and groaned under the wind's assault, whimpering softly and pressing against her mother. Deliasa held her close, but the girl could not settle, could not relax enough to sleep, her body tense with fear. Alan watched them for a moment from his chair near the fire, watched the girl shake and heard her frightened sounds, and made a decision that surprised even himself. "Come here," he said gruffly, his voice rough from disuse. Deliasa looked uncertain, not sure if this was a command or an offer, but brought Chloe closer anyway. Alan pulled a thick blanket off his chair, the one he used on the coldest nights, and wrapped it around both of them with surprisingly gentle movements. The girl calmed almost immediately, comforted by the warmth and the solid presence of the man who had become, somehow, a central part of their strange little family. Spring came eventually, as it always does, though winter fought hard before giving up its grip. The snow melted into mud that made every step treacherous, then into green grass as warmer days became more frequent. New life appeared everywhere, nature's eternal cycle of death and rebirth. Calves were born to the surviving cattle, wobbly-legged and curious. Birds returned from wherever they had gone to escape the winter, filling the air with song. Wildflowers bloomed in patches of color across the fields. The farm began to truly recover from the violence of the previous season, scars fading if never quite disappearing. Alan found himself actually smiling sometimes, a strange feeling after so many years of just surviving day to day, after so long viewing each sunrise as just another battle to be fought. One afternoon in late spring, they were working together to build a new chicken coop to replace the one that had been damaged in the fire, measuring and cutting lumber, when a rider appeared on the horizon. Alan tensed immediately, his hand moving toward his axe, which was never far away, old instincts taking over. But Deliasa touched his arm with her hand, a gentle restraint. "Wait," she said quietly. She had developed an instinct for danger, could read threats before they became apparent, could sense malice or benign intention in ways that Alan could not quite understand. This one is different, not the same as the hunters. The rider was a woman, older than Alan by perhaps a decade, her hair gray and tied back in a practical style that suggested function over fashion. She dismounted with the ease of someone who had spent most of her life on horseback and approached slowly, her hands visible and empty of weapons, her body language carefully non-threatening. "Alan," she said in a voice that carried authority without being harsh, "I am Amberly. I run the trading post at Crossroads." "I know who you are," Alan said carefully, his body still tense, still ready to respond to threat. "Everyone knows who you are. What do you want with me?" Amberly looked at Deliasa with frank curiosity rather than disgust or hatred, studying her like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Then she looked at Chloe, who was peeking out from behind her mother's legs. Her face was hard to read, neutral in a way that gave nothing away. "I have heard stories about this farm," she said after a moment, "about what happened here, about the battle with the wolves and the hunters, about who you have got working for you and living under your protection." She paused, letting that sink in. "I have a proposition for you, if you are willing to hear it." Alan's grip tightened on his axe, his knuckles going white. "Not interested in propositions. Just want to be left alone to work my farm." "Hear me out before you refuse," Amberly continued, her voice reasonable. "There are more of them out there. More blues, hiding in the forest, starving slowly, being hunted, by humans and predators alike. Some are willing to work, desperate for any chance at survival. I need workers I can trust at the trading post, people who will not run at the first sign of trouble, who will work hard for fair treatment. You have proven that trust between humans and blues is possible, that it can work when both sides are willing." "I am not running a charity," Alan said flatly, his voice hard. "I took her in because she saved my life, because it was practical. That does not make me a crusader or a missionary." "I am not asking you to run a charity," Amberly replied with a slight smile. "I am asking if you would be willing to vouch for them, to tell others that it is possible. If there are others like her," she nodded at Deliasa, "who want honest work, who want to live without hiding and starving, I will pay them fair wages. I will house them decently. I will treat them like any other workers. But I need someone people respect to say it can work, to be an example. Your reputation carries weight now, whether you wanted it to or not." Alan looked at Deliasa, seeking her opinion without words. She met his eyes and he saw something there he had not expected. Hope not for herself because she already had relative safety, but for others, for more of her kind who might be out there suffering as she had suffered, dying as they so easily could have died. "I will think about it," Alan said finally. The words dragged from him reluctantly. "That is all I am promising. I will think about it." Amberly nodded, seeming satisfied with that small concession. "That is all I ask. Think about it. If you decide you are willing, send word to the trading post." She mounted her horse with practiced ease and rode off, leaving them standing in the muddy yard, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. That night, Alan could not sleep, his mind churning through implications and possibilities and dangers. He kept thinking about what Amberly had said, about others out there hiding and starving. He had never considered himself particularly brave or noble, had never wanted to be special or different. He had helped Deliasa and Chloe because they had saved his life first, because it made practical sense, because he needed the help and she was willing to work, But now people saw him as something else. As a bridge maybe, as proof that coexistence was possible. The responsibility felt heavy, unwanted. "You should do it," Deliasa said from her place by the fire, wrapped in blankets, apparently also unable to sleep. She must have known he was awake, known he was struggling with the decision. "Help them, like you helped us. Give them a chance." "I did not help you," Alan said gruffly, his voice rough with emotion he did not want to acknowledge. "You helped me first. You threw rocks at wolves and dragged me to safety and kept me alive. I just did not let you starve afterward." "You let us stay," Deliasa countered quietly. "You could have let us starve. Could have killed us. Could have turned us into those hunters for a reward." "Many would have. Many did." She paused, her voice dropping even lower. "My settlement was destroyed by humans who saw us as vermin. We fled and most died in the forest. We were dying too before we found you." Alan thought about that little blue stone Chloe had left on his doorstep weeks ago, about the girl's head resting trustingly against his knee after the battle, about the woman who had thrown herself at wolves to protect his cattle without being asked or ordered. He thought about the fact that they had become something like family in his mind, that he looked forward to their presence at meals, that the house felt empty when they were outside working. "Maybe," he said finally, the word heavy with uncertainty. "We will see. I need to think more." More refugees came over the following months as word spread through the hidden communities where Blues lived in fear and hunger. Not many at first, just a trickle. Some were humans fleeing violence in the settlements, fleeing the kind of mob justice that killed without trial, fleeing poverty or persecution. Others were aliens looking for any sanctuary they could find, willing to risk the journey for even a slim chance at survival. Alan did not take them all in, could not take them all in without drawing more attention than he could safely handle. He was selective, careful. He looked for people who were willing to work hard, who understood that survival on the frontier meant pulling your weight and then some. He looked for people who could put aside old hatreds long enough to see that everyone bled red under the skin, whether that skin was pink or blue or green or any other color evolution had painted it. He sent some away with directions to Amberley's trading post. He kept a few who showed particular promise or need. The farm expanded in small increments, growing slowly but steadily. More buildings went up, rough but functional. More fields were cleared, trees cut and stumps removed. More cattle were purchased or traded for. It stopped being just Alan's farm and became something else, something without a formal name or legal structure. A community maybe, or at least the beginning of one, the seed from which something larger might grow. There were fights, of course there were fights. Old prejudices did not die easy, did not surrender without struggle. Humans who had lost family to alien attacks found it hard to work beside Blues. Blues who had been hunted by humans found it hard to trust. But Alan had a reputation now, had become a figure of respect and fear, and his acts enforced rules that were simple and inflexible. Work hard, treat each other with basic decency, pull your weight, or leave. Violence was not tolerated except in defense. Theft was punished with expulsion. Respect was mandatory. The rules were fair and consistently applied, and that made all the difference. Kevin, a young human who had been part of a family, killed by wolves, joined the farm despite his own misgivings. He was maybe 20 years old, lean and bitter, carrying grief like a physical weight. He could not understand at first why Alan let the Blues stay, could not reconcile his need for revenge with the reality of working beside them. He started small fights, caused problems with snide comments and aggressive posturing, tested boundaries constantly. One night, 3 dreadwolves attacked the new chicken coop they had built, drawn by the smell of easy prey. Kevin was on guard duty, armed with a spear, but when the wolves appeared, his body froze with remembered terror. He saw his parents dying again, saw the wolves tearing them apart, and could not move. A blue-skinned man named Harriet, strong as an ox and twice as stubborn, saw Kevin's paralysis and put himself between the boy and the wolves without hesitation. He took a nasty wound across his ribs from claws that opened him up to the bone, but he gave Kevin time to recover, time to shake off the paralysis and fight. Together they drove off the wolves, though both were injured. Kevin helped carry Harriet back to the bunkhouse afterward, his arms supporting the blue man's weight, his worldview cracking like an egg. It was hard to hate someone who had bled protecting you, hard to maintain prejudice when someone had saved your life at cost to themselves. Kevin never became friends with the Blues exactly, but he stopped causing problems, started working with them rather than against them, and that was enough. Chloe Lee grew over the seasons, her body stretching and changing as children do. She was taller now, her limbs getting longer, losing that toddler roundness and developing the lean build of a child who worked hard and ate well enough. She learned both languages fluently, human and her mother's tongue, switching between them with the unconscious ease that only children possess. She helped with the animals, showed a natural talent for calming them that seemed almost supernatural. The cattle trusted her in a way they never quite trusted the adults, would follow her without ropes or prodding. She had a gift for understanding animal behavior, for reading their moods and intentions. The other children, both human and alien, followed her too, drawn to her confidence and her ability to bridge the two groups. She became a leader among them without trying, without claiming any special authority, just through natural charisma and the fact that she had been there first, that she was Alan's favorite, though he would never admit it aloud. One evening as the sun set over the farm painting, everything in shades of orange and gold, Alan stood on his rebuilt porch watching people work together in the fields below. Humans and aliens side by side, their backs bent in the eternal labor of farming. Not friends necessarily, not all of them, but not enemies either. Co-workers, allies. People bound together by the shared struggle to survive on a planet that wanted them all dead equally, that made no distinction between human and alien when it came to the brutality of its environment. The sunset was beautiful in a way that Alan had stopped noticing years ago when survival became his only focus. But now he found himself appreciating it again, found himself able to see beauty rather than just judging whether the color of the sky meant rain was coming. Deliasa came to stand beside him on the porch as the light faded. She did that now, stood close without asking permission, comfortable in his space. They had gotten comfortable with each other's presence over the months and seasons, had developed an easy familiarity that came from shared hardship and mutual respect. "You did good thing," she said quietly, her accent much lighter now, her grammar nearly perfect. "I did not do anything," Alan replied, using the same argument he always used. "You people did the work. All I did was give you a place to do it." "You gave chance," Deliasa countered, her voice gentle but firm. "That is everything. Without chance, without first person willing to take risk, nothing else possible." She smiled, and Alan realized it was something he saw often now, that transformation of her face that made her look younger, less worn by hardship. You took risk when you could have chosen safety. That makes all difference. That night they had what could almost be called a celebration, though nobody used that word. Nothing fancy or planned, no special occasion. Just everyone gathering around a large fire pit they had dug in the center of the expanded yard, sharing food from their combined stores, telling stories as the stars came out overhead. Some stories were about the homes they had left behind, about worlds they would never see again, about families scattered across the galaxy by war and poverty and chance. Others were about close calls with predators, narrow escapes from death, small victories that had kept them alive. Kevin told the story of the night Harriet had saved him, and Harriet told the story from his perspective, and they both laughed at the memory, though it had nearly killed them both. Chloe fell asleep against Alan's side, exhausted from playing all day with the other children, human and alien both. Learning together that differences did not have to mean danger, that skin color was less important than character. Alan looked around at these people, this strange collection of survivors who had somehow ended up here on his farm, and felt something unfamiliar settling into his chest. Contentment, maybe, or at least peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you are where you are supposed to be, doing what you are meant to do, even if it was not what you had planned or imagined for your life. The future was uncertain, would always be uncertain on this frontier where death lived in the forest and suspicion lived in the settlements. There would be more wolves testing their defenses, more harsh winters that killed, the weak and the unlucky, More people who could not accept what they had built here, who saw it as an abomination or a threat to be destroyed. But they would face it together, and that made all the difference. Alone, any of them would die quickly. Together, they had a chance. That simple math drove everything. As the fire burned down to embers and people drifted off to their beds in the bunkhouses and sheds and corners they had claimed, Alan stayed outside a little longer. Deliasa sat with him in companionable silence, both of them watching the coals pulse with heat. The stars overhead were strange, not Earth's familiar constellations, but they had become familiar over the years. This was home now, as much as anywhere could be home on a planet that was not the one humans had evolved on. Not the place Alan had imagined when he had first come to this world full of hope and plans, but home nonetheless. "Thank you," Deliasa said quietly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "For what?" Alan asked, though he knew. "For feeding my hungry daughter when I had nothing to offer but work." Alan remembered that day with perfect clarity, that moment when a desperate alien woman had appeared at his fence and offered to work his cattle in exchange for food for her child. He remembered wanting to say no, wanting to turn them away, wanting to keep himself safe from judgment and persecution. He remembered deciding to take a chance despite his fear, deciding that practical help was worth the risk. "She is a good kid," Alan said simply. "You both earned your place here 100 times over." And that was true, the essential truth of their existence on this harsh world that cared nothing for ideology or prejudice. Nothing was given freely on the frontier. Everything was earned through blood and sweat and determination and the willingness to do what needed doing. The color of your skin did not matter when wolves were trying to kill you. Your species did not matter when the crops needed harvesting before the frost came. What mattered was whether you would stand shoulder to shoulder when danger came howling out of the forest, whether you would pull your weight when the work got hard, whether you would show dignity and courage when everything tried to break you, when the universe itself seemed determined to grind you into dust. They sat there together, watching the last embers of the fire fade to ash, while around them the community they had built together slept under stars that were not their own. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, it always did. The farm would continue to grow, or it would fail. More refugees would come, or they would stop coming. The settlements might accept what was happening here, or they might send militias to burn it all down. The future was unwritten, uncertain, dangerous. But for tonight, they had this moment of peace, hard-won and precious and worth fighting to protect. Years would pass, though Alan could not know it. In that moment, the farm would continue to grow, would become something larger than he had ever imagined. Chloe would grow up strong and capable, a bridge between two worlds in her very existence, fluent in both languages and comfortable in both cultures. She would remember always that first terrible year when survival was measured in days, when every meal was uncertain, when her mother had been desperate enough to offer servitude in exchange for food. She would remember the man who had said yes when he could have easily said no, who had taken a chance that saved their lives. Years later, she would tell the story to her own children, would explain how fear and courage could exist in the same heart, how prejudice could be overcome through shared struggle, how family could be chosen rather than born. Other settlements would hear about this place, this strange farm where different species worked together without violence. Some would condemn it, would call it an abomination against natural order and human supremacy. Others would visit, curious, wanting to understand how it was possible, wanting to see with their own eyes whether the stories were true. Slowly, painfully slowly, minds would begin to change. Not everyone's minds, never everyone's. Because prejudice runs deep and fear is a powerful teacher. But enough minds would change, just enough to make a difference, to create a shift in how people thought about what was possible, about what the future might hold. Alan would never consider himself a pioneer or a visionary or a hero. Those words felt false to him, too grand for what he actually was. He was just a farmer who had made a practical decision when faced with a problem. A woman had offered to work, he had needed workers, she had proven herself valuable, he had kept her on. It was that simple and that complicated and that human. But history does not always care about intentions, does not always honor the modesty of those who change things. Sometimes people become symbols without meaning to, without wanting to, without even understanding it until long after the fact. Sometimes a simple act of desperate pragmatism, a moment of choosing practical help over ideological purity, becomes something larger in the collective memory, something that changes how people think about what is possible and what is right. The sun rose the next morning like it always did, indifferent to the small dramas of the creatures below, caring nothing for their struggles or triumphs. The farm woke with the light, people stirring in their beds, animals needing tending, work waiting to be done. Alan emerged from his house into the cool morning air, stretched his scarred shoulders that still ached when the weather changed, and surveyed his domain with the satisfaction of someone who had built something real. Deliasa was already up, had already started the morning chores because she was always up first, always working before anyone else woke. Chloe was feeding the chickens, talking to them in that mixture of languages she had created, a hybrid that borrowed from both tongues and belonged to neither. It was just another day, just another morning on a frontier farm where the work was endless and the rewards were measured in survival rather than profit. But it was theirs, all of theirs together. They had fought for it, bled for it, earned it through struggle and perseverance, and the refusal to give up when giving up would have been easier. And that made it something worth protecting, something worth preserving, something worth passing down to the next generation. The wolves stayed away from this farm, having learned their lesson in blood. They found easier prey elsewhere, prey that did not fight back with such vicious efficiency, prey that was not defended by humans and blues working together. Other predators would come eventually, they always did, drawn by hunger or territory or simple aggression. But this place, this strange little community of the desperate and determined, would be ready. They had survived wolves and hunters in winter and their own prejudices. They would survive whatever came next because that was what survivors did. They adapted, they persisted, they refused to break even when breaking would have been understandable. And somewhere in other parts of the vast forest that covered most of this continent, other desperate people hiding in shadows would hear the stories. They would hear about a farm where a blue-skinned woman and her daughter had found sanctuary, where honest work earned honest pay and basic dignity, where the only thing that mattered was whether you would stand and fight when the danger came howling out of the darkness, where skin color was less important than character, where species was less important than courage. And some of them, the desperate ones with nothing left to lose, the ones who had been running and hiding for too long, would start walking toward that farm, looking for the same chance that Deliasa and Chloe had found, looking for a man named Alan who had proven that maybe, just maybe, different did not have to mean enemy, looking for a place where they could stop running, stop hiding, stop waiting to die, and instead start trying to live. The frontier was harsh, unforgiving, brutal in ways that settlers from Earth had never imagined when they looked at pictures and dreamed of new worlds. The planet was actively hostile, filled with predators that evolution had designed to kill anything that moved. The future was uncertain in ways both large and small, subject to the whims of weather and chance and human prejudice. But they faced it together, this strange family that had formed itself from necessity and survival. This collection of broken people who had found something worth fighting for in each other's company. That was the story, the whole story from beginning to middle to the present moment that would become history in time. Not a story of grand gestures or heroic speeches, not an epic of gods and monsters, but something smaller and more human. A story of small decisions made under pressure, of practical choices driven by necessity, of the simple human act of extending a hand when someone was falling, even when that hand might be blue instead of pink. She had said, "I will work with your cattle, man. Just feed my hungry daughter." And he had said yes, had taken that chance, had made that choice despite his fear. Everything else had followed from that moment, from that simple exchange, from that desperate offer and reluctant acceptance. All the survival and struggle, all the fighting and building, all the growth and change, all of it grew from that single seed planted in bloody mud while wolves howled in the distance. That was how things changed on the frontier, Alan thought as he watched the sun climb higher. Not through grand pronouncements or sweeping reforms, not through laws passed in distant capitals or ideologies debated by people who had never faced real danger. Change came through small acts repeated over and over, through individuals choosing to see people instead of categories, through the accumulated weight of 1,000 tiny decisions that slowly, painfully, slowly, shifted what seemed possible. The work called. There was always work, endless and demanding. But for just a moment longer, Alan stood on his porch and allowed himself to feel something like pride. Not pride in himself exactly, because he still believed he had just made practical choices, but pride in what they had built together, this community that should not exist but did anyway, this proof that survival did not require hatred, that coexistence was possible when people were willing to try. Then he picked up his tools and went to work, because pride did not fix fences or feed cattle or plant crops. Only work did that. Only the endless grinding labor of frontier farming, repeated day after day, season after season, year after year, until either you died or the land was tamed or some combination of both. And beside him, Deliasa went to work too, and Cloeli, and all the others who had found their way here. Together they would make it through another day and another after that. They would survive because they chose to, because giving up was not acceptable, because they had found something worth protecting here in this unlikely place. The wolves could howl all they wanted. This farm would stand.